China controls 90% of the world's rare earth processing. Not 90% of some niche industrial category. 90% of the material that goes into your phone, your car, your fighter jet, and your missile guidance system. And 5 days ago, Beijing just cut 14 European companies off from it, without warning. There's an old line making the rounds in Chinese policy circles right now, a twist on something Deng Xiaoping once said. Original was, the Middle East has oil, China has rare earths. The updated version going around today is even more pointed. America has chips, China has rare earths. That's not just a clever quote. That's the entire architecture of the 21st century tech war, summed up in 8 words. So here's what we're actually digging into today. China has spent 40 years quietly building a monopoly on the materials every advanced technology on Earth depends on. And right now, in real time, it's starting to squeeze that grip, one country at a time. Before we go further, it's worth being specific about what's actually inside these materials. Because rare earths sounds abstract until you realize how much of modern life quietly runs through them. Neodymium and praseodymium go into the magnets spinning inside electric vehicle motors and wind turbine generators. Dysprosium and terbium get added to those same magnets to keep them stable under the extreme heat generated by fighter jet engines and missile guidance systems. Samarium goes into some of the most heat-resistant magnets used in precision-guided munitions. Europium and other heavy rare earths show up in lasers, night vision equipment, and advanced radar systems. This isn't a niche mining story. It's the raw material layer underneath electric vehicles, wind energy, smartphones, MRI machines, fighter jets, and the missile systems every modern military depends on. Let's start with just how total this control actually is, because most people have no idea how lopsided this market really is. China mines around 70% of the world's rare earth elements. That number alone would already be enough to call it dominant. But mining isn't even the real choke point. The real choke point is processing, the complex chemical separation that turns raw ore into usable material, and China controls somewhere between 85 and 90% of that globally. When you narrow it down to heavy rare earth elements specifically, the ones used in the most advanced defense and semiconductor applications, China's control jumps to somewhere around 98 to 99%. That's not dominance. That's close to a total monopoly on the hardest, most specialized part of the supply chain. And it doesn't stop at raw processed material. China also manufactures around 92% of the world's neodymium iron-boron magnets, the powerful permanent magnets found in electric vehicle motors, wind turbines, fighter jet control surfaces, robotics actuators, and precision-guided missiles. If you want to build almost any advanced piece of hardware in 2026, from a Tesla to a Patriot missile, there's a very good chance the magnet inside it either came from China or was made using Chinese processed material. This wasn't an accident. China's government identified rare earths as a strategic priority decades ago and backed that decision with sustained investment, state subsidies, and vertical integration across the entire supply chain, from mining, through processing, through magnet manufacturing. Over half of all rare earth patents filed by Chinese entities came after 2011, which tells you exactly when this strategy shifted from opportunistic to deliberate. 6 state-owned enterprises now control around 70% of China's total rare earth output. This is not a market outcome. This is 4 decades of industrial policy paying off exactly as designed. It's worth appreciating just how deliberate this build-out actually was, because it explains why catching up is so difficult now. China didn't just happen to have more rare earth deposits than everyone else. Rare earths, despite the name, aren't even geologically rare. They exist in meaningful quantities across the United States, Australia, Brazil, and plenty of other countries. What China built that nobody else did was the expensive, technically difficult, environmentally messy middle layer of the supply chain, the separation and refining infrastructure that turns raw ore into usable, high-purity material. That infrastructure took decades of sustained state investment, tolerance for the environmental costs of separation chemistry, and a willingness to operate at a loss for years while competitors abroad gave up and shut down. By the time the rest of the world realized how much leverage that infrastructure represented, China wasn't just ahead, it had become close to irreplaceable. Now here's what actually happened this week, and why it matters so much. On July 24th, China's Ministry of Commerce added 14 European companies to its export control list. banning Chinese suppliers from sending them rare earths and rare earth magnets without special government authorization. No prolonged negotiation, no lengthy public warning period. Just a formal announcement, and 14 companies suddenly found themselves locked out of the material their production lines depend on. And this wasn't an isolated move. It came less than a month after Beijing did almost the exact same thing to the United States. The 14 European companies caught up in this aren't random names either. These are firms operating in sectors China has specifically identified as dual use, meaning their products or components could theoretically serve both civilian and military purposes. That framing gives Beijing enormous discretion. Almost any company working in defense electronics, advanced manufacturing, or precision engineering can plausibly be labeled dual use if the government decides it wants leverage over that specific business. And once a company lands on that list, it doesn't just lose access to raw rare earth ore, it loses access to the processed materials, the alloys, and in some cases the manufacturing technology itself, without a special export license that Beijing controls entirely at its own discretion. In June, China imposed new export controls on 10 American firms, including 2 companies that sit at the very center of Washington's plan to build a rare earth supply chain that doesn't run through China at all. Officials in Beijing framed that move as retaliation, specifically for the US adding a batch of leading Chinese tech companies to a military blacklist earlier that same month. 2 separate tit-for-tat strikes aimed at 2 separate US allies within the same 6-week window. Think about the message that sends. China isn't just defending its own market anymore. It's actively targeting the specific companies and countries trying to build an alternative to it. That's not a company protecting its business. That's a state using its supply chain as a geopolitical weapon, pointed directly at the projects designed to escape it. So how is the US actually responding to all of this? Because the answer is aggressively, and the pace of the response has been almost as fast as China's squeeze. Over a single 5-week stretch in June, from June 2nd to June 26th, the US government committed roughly $2.9 billion in direct funding, specifically to build a rare earth metals and permanent magnet supply chain outside of China. Companies receiving that support layered on an additional $1.4 billion of their own private capital during that exact same window. The Department of Defense opened its own military installations to critical minerals processors for the first time in history, giving private companies access to government land and infrastructure to accelerate domestic processing capacity. And Washington expanded an international alliance specifically built around securing supply chains for rare earth-dependent technologies. All of that disclosed within a single month. That's not a scattered series of unrelated announcements. That's a coordinated, urgent push, and the urgency itself tells you how seriously Washington is taking this threat. This push has a name, too. Earlier this year, the Trump administration launched an initiative called Project Vault, a minerals stockpile program prioritizing the development of mines and processing operations for more than 50 minerals the government has deemed critical, rare earths chief among them. Alongside Project Vault, Washington has been expediting new mine openings, backing new smelting operations domestically, and even exploring deep-sea mining options as an alternative source of these materials, since some rare earth-bearing minerals can be found in seabed nodules far from any land-based deposit. None of that is a coincidence either. Every one of these moves is a direct response to the same underlying problem, an economy and a military that discovered, all at once, just how deep its dependency on a single foreign supplier actually runs. The centerpiece of that push is a company called MP Materials, and its story is worth understanding in detail because it shows you exactly how hard, how expensive, and how slow it actually is to build an alternative to China's supply chain from scratch. MP Materials owns and operates Mountain Pass, the only rare earth mining and processing site of real scale anywhere in North America. In July of last year, the company announced what it called a transformational public-private partnership with the Department of Defense. The Pentagon made a $400 million equity investment directly into the company, along with a 10-year price floor commitment on neodymium praseodymium oxide set at $110 per kilogram, guaranteeing MP Materials a stable price no matter what China does to the market in the meantime. The Pentagon also signed a 10-year agreement to buy 100% of the output from a new magnet manufacturing plant the company is building in Texas. That new facility, called the 10X plant, is going up in Northlake, Texas, as part of a $1.25 billion total investment package. Once it's fully operational, it's expected to add about 7,000 metric tons of magnet production capacity annually, bringing MP Materials' total U.S. magnet output to around 10,000 metric tons a year. On top of the government backing, the company also secured $1 billion in private construction financing from J.P. Morgan Chase and Goldman Sachs, and a $150 million Defense Department loan specifically to expand heavy rare earth separation capabilities back at Mountain Pass. Wall Street has taken notice of just how central this one company has become to U.S. strategy. MP Materials stock has climbed more than 100% over the past year, as investors bet on it becoming the anchor of America's rare earth independence effort, even as shares have pulled back sharply in recent weeks on questions about how quickly the company can actually scale. That volatility captures the entire story in miniature. Enormous strategic importance, genuine government backing, and still deep uncertainty about whether execution can match the ambition on the timeline everyone's counting on. That's a serious amount of capital and serious institutional commitment. But here's the number that puts all of it into perspective. MP Materials' new facility isn't even expected to begin commissioning until 2028. And even once it's fully up and running, 10,000 metric tons of annual magnet capacity is a small fraction of the roughly 250,000 metric tons of magnet production capacity China already has running today. The United States is spending billions of dollars and multiple years to build something that, even in the best-case scenario, still leaves China controlling the overwhelming majority of global supply. That's the part most headlines don't spell out clearly enough. This isn't a race the US can win in 2 or 3 years, no matter how much money gets thrown at it. Experts studying this exact problem estimate that closing the gap with China's rare earth supply chain realistically requires 10 to 15 years of sustained government support and investment, not a handful of billion-dollar announcements timed for a news cycle. Okay, now here's the twist, and it's the part that should genuinely change how you think about this entire standoff. China has actually paused several of its most aggressive rare earth export controls. Back in November of last year, following a meeting between Trump and Xi, Beijing officially suspended the implementation of a fresh round of export restrictions that had been announced in October, restrictions that would have covered 5 additional rare earth elements, including holmium, erbium, thulium, europium, and ytterbium. That suspension is set to run until November of this year, part of a broader diplomatic de-escalation following talks between the two leaders. So sit with that contradiction for a second. China paused its biggest planned escalation as a confidence-building gesture toward Washington, and in the same window of time, it turned around and hit 14 European companies, plus 10 American firms, with brand new, narrower, more targeted restrictions. That's not random. That's a country running 2 tracks simultaneously. Broad de-escalation to keep the overall US-China relationship stable ahead of bigger negotiations, paired with sharp, surgical retaliation against the specific companies and countries actively working to build around it. China isn't swinging a sledgehammer here. It's using a scalpel, and it's using it precisely on the projects that threaten its long-term position the most. And there's a historical precedent for exactly this kind of behavior that's worth knowing, because it shows this isn't a new playbook. Back in 2010, during a territorial dispute with Japan, China quietly restricted rare earth exports specifically to Japanese industry, and the effect on Japanese manufacturers was immediate and severe. Factories producing everything from hybrid car components to advanced electronics found themselves scrambling for alternative supply within weeks, with some production lines slowing dramatically as materials simply stopped arriving at the border. That single episode is widely credited as the moment the rest of the world woke up to how much leverage China actually held over this material. It took over a decade for that warning to translate into serious diversification efforts elsewhere, and even now, in 2026, the world still hasn't caught up. If a 15-year head start wasn't enough time to catch up last time, it's worth asking seriously whether the current scramble is any different. What makes today's situation more dangerous than 2010 is scale. Back then, rare earth leverage was mostly about consumer electronics and hybrid vehicles. Today, the exact same leverage sits underneath electric vehicle mandates across multiple continents, the renewable energy transition, and, most critically, the defense industrial base of the United States and its closest allies. The stakes attached to this exact same choke point have grown enormously in just 15 years, while the choke point itself has barely loosened at all. There's also a pricing angle to this story that rarely gets attention outside of industry circles. In 2022, China actually increased its own rare earth processing output by 25% specifically to push global prices down. That sounds counterintuitive. More supply usually means Beijing loses leverage, right? But the real goal was to make it financially unsustainable for foreign competitors to keep producing. Lower prices squeezed profit margins everywhere else in the world, and a wave of foreign rare earth projects outside China ended up scaling back or halting production entirely because they simply couldn't compete on cost. China doesn't only control supply, it can also weaponize price itself, flooding the market when it wants to bankrupt emerging competition and tightening supply when it wants to apply direct pressure. That's a level of market control most industries never have to deal with from a single country. You can see that same price power showing up again right now in specific numbers. Dysprosium oxide, one of the heavy rare earths critical to defense and EV applications, was recently assessed at around $2,100 per kilogram in North America. Terbium oxide came in even higher, around $4,800 per kilogram, and climbing. Those aren't small commodity price movements. Those are premiums building specifically because buyers outside China know they're paying for scarcity and supply security, not just for raw material. And those premiums don't stay contained to industrial buyers. They eventually flow downstream into the price of everything built with these materials: electric vehicles, wind turbines, consumer electronics, defense hardware. A car manufacturer paying a security premium on magnets for its EV motors either absorbs that cost or passes it on to the buyer. A defense contractor paying more for guidance system components either eats the margin hit or bills it back to the government, which means taxpayers. Rare earth scarcity, in other words, isn't just a geopolitical abstraction playing out in trade filings. It's a quiet tax on nearly every piece of advanced technology built outside China, and that tax has been rising steadily for years, with no clear ceiling in sight. So where does that leave the rest of the world caught in the middle of this standoff? Countries like Japan and South Korea, which depend heavily on rare earth imports for their own advanced manufacturing sectors, are watching this unfold with genuine anxiety. Japan in particular has been here before, and it's one of the very few countries outside China that actually has meaningful rare earth magnet production capacity of its own, which makes it a potential partner for both the US and Europe as this standoff continues. Expect deeper alliances between Washington, Tokyo, Seoul, and Brussels specifically built around this material, not because any of them particularly want to team up, but because none of them individually have enough leverage to face China's rare earth dominance alone. South Korea faces its own version of this pressure, from a slightly different angle. Its semiconductor and battery industries, the same industries powering companies like Samsung and SK Hynix, depend on a steady, predictable flow of rare earth inputs to keep production lines running without disruption. Any sustained tightening from Beijing doesn't just threaten defense contractors or EV makers. It threatens the exact memory chip and battery industries that South Korea has built its entire modern economy around, which is part of why you're increasingly seeing Seoul align more closely with Washington and Tokyo on supply chain security, even in areas where the three countries have historically competed rather than cooperated. Which brings us to the real question underneath this entire story. Is China's current wave of targeted export controls a genuine long-term strategy to permanently choke off Western supply chains? Or is it a calculated pressure tactic, timed carefully around ongoing negotiations, designed to remind Washington and Brussels exactly how much leverage Beijing still holds, even while broader diplomatic talks continue in the background? Because remember, the US has spent the last several years building up its own leverage over China, through chip export controls, through the entity list, through tariffs and technology bans stacked one on top of another. And now, watch what's actually happening. Every time Washington tightens its grip on chips, Beijing tightens its grip on rare earths right back. Two countries, each holding a chokehold on something the other one desperately needs, and neither one willing to let go first. That paraphrased line from earlier captures it perfectly. America has chips, China has rare earths, and right now, in the middle of 2026, both sides are testing exactly how hard they can squeeze before the other one is forced to blink. Here's what to watch next. Keep an eye on November of this year, when China's paused October restrictions are set to either lapse back into effect or get extended again, depending on how the broader relationship between Washington and Beijing is holding up by then. And keep watching MP Materials' Texas facility, because its actual production numbers, not just the funding headlines, will tell you whether America's rare earth independence push is turning into something real, or whether it's still years away from making any meaningful dent in China's grip on the material inside almost everything we build. There's also a broader signal worth tracking heading into that same window. Trump and Xi are expected to continue their pattern of high-level meetings later this year, and rare earths have become one of the clearest bargaining chips either side can put on the table, alongside chips, tariffs, and technology export rules. If this pattern holds, expect rare earth policy to keep swinging between sudden tightening and surprise de-escalation, timed less around pure economics and more around whatever leverage each side needs heading into the next round of talks. For any company, in any country, trying to plan a supply chain around this material, that unpredictability might end up being the most expensive cost of all, more expensive in some ways than the price of the metal itself.